Hello, guys, gals, and non-binary pals. Welcome to HP to XP. I am Chris, the Dungeon Master for our Adventures in Umbrenthal campaign, and today we are going to be doing a little bit of a roundtable with some of our cast, and we're going to be talking about sort of the intersection of our real world and fantasy, and how that comes into play as artists, as gamers, as creators, and getting a sense of ways of making that work. Couple of things. Thank you to everybody who has been tuning in on Wednesdays for our live stream campaign. We came back this past Wednesday for our episode 4. I think it was a good time was had by all. If you have not had the chance to check that out yet, remember you can flip on over to YouTube and check out our VODs. Let me go ahead and spell socials right, and you can get links to our Instagram, our Twitter, our Discord page, and our YouTube right here in chat, so please hop on over and check those out. So today we are gonna start by focusing on sort of the topic of fantasy violence. This is something that I have thought a lot about over the years, and it was actually one of the questions that was posed to everybody who was looking at being part of this campaign when we started. One of the things that we've talked about is that by virtue of the way Dungeons and Dragons is structured, it is a game that inherently defaults to violence as its main problem-solving tool. If you go in and look at the 3 core manuals that Wizards produces, the Player's Handbook, the Dungeon Master's Guide, and the Monster Manual, those books are steeped with the presumption that combat is the mechanism that you're going to use. And because of that, I think it warrants having a discussion about where fantasy violence comes into being fun, being an appropriate expression of gameplay with a sensitivity to the fact that many people, both people who are playing a game, but then also in our circumstance as creators who are cultivating an audience, people who will be in that audience, have real world experiences with violence that are at best difficult and in some cases quite traumatic. So I think having that conversation is important. This is one that has mattered to me for many, many years. When my son, who's now a junior in college, was 7th or 8th grade, we had a conversation about this was the time when the Senate torture report was being released. And we had a conversation about the difference between real violence and fantasy violence. And the first example that I used with him was that in the movie Taken, no one is actually being tortured. It is a fantasy that depicts violence as a viable tool. And you need to parse that. In the same sense, porn is not documentary. And having that understanding, I think, helps us parse good information from bad. There's a lot of data out there on the role that fantasy violence plays in how we frame moral and ethical judgments about the world. One of the sort of overarching concepts, and I'm going to provide links in our YouTube video to these articles, is something that's called the general aggression model. And what that psychological social model talks about is the idea that episodic life experiences, including perhaps repeated media exposure, serve as sort of these trials and developmental grounds for the worldviews that we're going to hold. And that model is one that many people point to when they talk about the way fantasy violence can be problematic in media and in video games, films, television in particular, in visual media. There isn't as much focus on print media because it is inherent on the reader to do a little bit more work and it is not being saturated with imagery. That said, there is no real causal link between video game violence and aggression more broadly. A lot of studies have been done on this over the years. And again, I'll link to one in our YouTube comments where if you want to download it and read it, you can. But a 2020 article on adolescent video game violence and aggression goes in and does basically a meta-analysis and looks at most of the data that's come out, and there's no causal conclusion. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be having these conversations and thinking about these things. Again, D&D as a game, and many tabletop games, are rooted in violence as a tool. So that's sort of where we're going to talk today. So I've got 3 members from the cast. I have our very own Sarah Kate, Sarah Jordan, and Jacob. Good morning, all. Welcome.
Morning, Chris.
Morning, Chris.
What say ye? I could pose a particular question, but let's just see what people think.
Where to start? I guess a good thing to put out there is that something that I try to live by as far as violence, whether it be in games, video games, live games, role-playing games, and their comparison to real life, is that violence is never the best answer, but it's hard to argue that, or it's hard to argue against the fact that violence is sometimes the most effective answer. It's kind of a razor edge as far as when those instances apply that it's the most effective, but I like to believe that it's never the best answer. Even in games, there's always another option.
Why did you laugh, Jake?
I was just thinking about it. So it really depends on whether or not 2 parties, whether it be organizations or people or societies or just 2 people, are able to communicate. So if you remove the ability for 2 different parties to communicate, whether they speak different languages or they just don't understand each other, the only thing that you have left is violence, pretty much. And I think that goes back to how we developed as people. If we look at tribal societies, when we just had sticks and spears and rocks, and how the human mind has developed to only be able to feel a kinship for 150 people or less. So it really depends on whether or not you're able to communicate. And being able to other someone is much easier if you're not able to communicate. So.
For sure. Yeah, I think that I'm going to go with Anara's point to make life easier to distinguish between my Sarahs. I think that Anara's point is a good one, that violence is a tool, right? In the real world and in fantasy, it is a mechanism. It is a tool. If we go back to our von Clausewitz, war is politics and another mechanism, right? I'm butchering the quote, but I'm on track. It is an extension of negotiation. It's just an escalation of it. Mm-hmm. And in some cases, in the real world, violence is perhaps the only solution. If you are being confronted with immediate danger and threat, sometimes the only way to respond to that is with violence. You may not have the time or space to actually diffuse or de-escalate a situation. But I agree that it shouldn't be the starting point. I know for sure that, Sarah Jordan, Jacob, and I have all been in situations where violence was the dynamic that was going on. Both Sarah Jordan and Jacob with military backgrounds, me in a fire service background with dealing with a whole bunch of gang violence in the areas that I worked in. Yeah, it's sometimes that's how things go. The question then becomes, what do we as game players, first and foremost, what do we have? Should we care about violence in games? Should it matter to us? Sarah, what do you think?
I mean, I think that as far as Dungeons and Dragons goes, I think it's kind of funny to even pose that as a question, because why else would most of our equipment that we care about, whether you start with equipment or you start with money and you buy your equipment, you buy weapons, just you're always prepared. Even as a level 0 character, your character is inclined to have to be in some sort of combat at some point. That's just expected. I've actually thought about it would be a really neat take on a character that would not prepare themselves that way, because it just doesn't happen. So I've definitely tossed around that idea, but in the world of D&D, that would put you at a serious disadvantage. And that's just how that goes. But other than that, I don't personally like fighting in real life, but in game, it is fun. So finding that balance between knowing what you're fighting for and just shooting to shoot, I mean, it's a hard line to try not to cross. I think we do a good job of that, though. We always try and be, we always try to take the high road before doing that, as evidentiary in our last meeting between Aziris and the golden-faced dragonborn. So everybody tries.
So Jacob is scrolling his face up, and I think I might know why. What are you thinking, Jake?
Okay, so personally, as someone who does like to fight, I think that that isn't necessarily like, so there's a few different approaches to anyone who is interested in fighting, and most of the time, or a vast majority of people who are interested in fighting don't actually do it very well. So the approach that I've had throughout my entire life, that since I began doing martial arts pretty regularly when I was 20, was that it was sort of like a hobby and a development of skill set, and it was a physical challenge. There's a lot of kinship and, I guess, a familial bond that you would have with people that you're fighting with or you're training with, and it's definitely a different kind of mindset than most people are either accustomed to or are comfortable exploring. You learn a lot about yourself while you're being a martial artist, for sure. But a lot of the time, I mean, I could talk about when I was a bouncer, I guess, but a lot of people who are interested in fighting just genuinely either don't have a fully developed forebrain, or they just don't understand the whole scope of it. Because the more you learn about martial arts and fighting, the more you understand how actually dangerous it is. So even if you are pretty good at fighting, it really just for you to get permanently injured, it would not be very difficult, even if you're very good at martial arts. Like if you're fighting in the street and someone just hits you over the back of the head when you're not looking, it's super easy to get permanently injured. So in general, except for people with permanent, I guess, personality defects or hyper aggression, most martial artists are not very violent people. And the training that they do or integrate into their lives is a form of release from the desires to do something like that. But yeah, violence does solve a lot of problems, I will say. It's just, what level on the spectrum of violence are we talking about? So if you're talking about actually physically handling someone, well, then that stops a problem from escalating some of the time. Or if you're deterring someone from being violent, that's just as important. But in order to deter someone from being violent, you need to be able to be violent yourself, because someone who is so determined or of the belief that they can impose their will upon other people is not going to be deterred by words, because that's not what they're after. They're after feeling a sense of dominance and the ability to impose their will on other people. So they're not going to like listen to reason, for the same reason that individuals who are in relationships and they're abusers, like they didn't listen or care all of those other times that they physically abused the person that they were with. So
yeah, I think that and I think that there's that very real component of, again, we can sort of parse out the difference between violence as the best choice in a moment that because of those dynamics, right? There's just aggressiveness can be the best choice to solve an acute problem. Where the challenge gets in, and I think where something that you're leading to in what you're talking about as far as the difference between somebody who is trained in the application of violence and somebody who's not, is that people who are consumers of media have a fictitious view of violence.
they sure do.
Mm-hmm.
They sure do, yeah.
I know I have met many people in my life who think that violence is a cute, fun thing. None of them have ever been punched in the throat.
Yeah. Everyone's got their one move that they would do, right? Everyone's got their, if I got into a fight, I would just grab them by the balls and twist. Like, everybody's got their one special move that they've just been holding on to for years that they're going to use when they get into a fight. Yeah, that's funny.
So I want to come back, though, to the idea of, should we, as players, as people who not only are playing a game, but also are putting that game out. I think Sarah K brings up a good point that, in general, our party thus far seems to be deferring to a generally lawful standpoint. In the context of the lawful structure that they're in, right? That obviously changes. And spoilers, you're likely to see the boundaries of what is lawful change as you move about this world. Where you are now in the Politia may have a vastly different sense of what is lawful than other parts of that world. So I think that's certainly a thing. But again, more broadly, in the context of being creators putting this out there, what do we have a responsibility? Do you feel a responsibility, might be a better question individually, in how you use and portray violence through your character? Sarah, Jordan, what?
I think as players, we definitely have a responsibility as far as portraying violence within our game world through our characters. We've got a responsibility to our character to make sure that they're portraying violence in a way that is appropriate for the situation through that character. I know that Anara, she comes from a world where violence and aggression is more a common usage tool within society to keep the masses in line, to keep the citizenry in line, to use it as a tool to either keep in check or to conquer those outside of the Drow community. But as Anara is learning, she's also discovering that violence isn't always the answer. Sometimes there are better ways to do things. So that's one of the character journeys that she's on, is trying to discover different ways to do things outside of violence. But as far as responsibilities as players, we also have a responsibility to our audience, to be sensitive to the needs of our audience, to be sensitive to things that are going on in the world around us, to the point where, like we did 2 Wednesdays ago, we took a break from playing because of the violence that was going on in the world. As collectively as a group, we felt that it wasn't appropriate to play a game that utilizes violence as a form of entertainment when real world violence was going on in our capital. So I think that being responsible as players, being responsible as a team, we have to give specific attention to things that are actually going on in our real world, to make sure that our game isn't mimicking that.
Sarah Kay, thoughts, comments, ideas?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to toss around the difference between lawful versus meaningful combat, because we don't have to engage in combat with anybody. I think one of the things that makes us unique as a group is that you definitely try very hard to make sure that our combat is meaningful, as in relationship to the story, it pushes us forward in storyline. It's not just we meet wolves in the woods and nothing comes of it. So just for example,
no, I already did that.
Well, yeah, but I mean, like, that's not every single session. That's all that it is, you know. Like, we could end up seeing any of these enemies that we spare or, you know, let go. Again, the trope of letting the BBEG pass you by is one of the biggest tropes in D&D, and everybody loves to joke about it. You know, was that gnome that we saw 3 taverns ago the BBEG? That's just that's a joke that I personally like to throw around. But as far as my personal character goes, she is very much a follower, not a leader. So she definitely relies on the thought process of everybody around her. Like, do we attack this thing because I have an axe? So I think being careful of that is really important for me, because I don't want to just, personally, that's not how I act, but that's my character. So it's interesting for me to do that.
Yeah, well, and I think Jake brought up an interesting point before in talking about the role that learning, either being learning through experience that you did not set out to have about the outcomes of real world violence, or studying violence in the real world. I think that you gain an understanding of where expressing yourself in a game and giving vent to those very natural human emotions, that the frustration that leads to violence, right? I think violence is often an outcome of especially if you are initiating it, is often a result of feeling frustrated in your other aims, right? You're trying to accomplish things by another way. It's not working. That frustration boils up and pours out in a violent mechanism. I think in a game that can be a great way of working through that, in the way the game can be a great way to RP other things, right? Combat is not inherently not role-playing. It is, in fact, one of the ways you role-play your character. And, you know, martial arts, you know, grappling sports in particular, I think are ones where people get a chance to role-play violence. There, you know, there's a consequential way of role-playing violence. There are a set of boundaries, there are a set of limits, there is ideally a set of circumstances that will prevent you from suffering that permanent injury that is a very real outcome of unmoderated violence, you know, unrefereed violence. So yeah, I think that that's an entirely appropriate response in a D&D game. Jake, you in your character, so you're playing a paladin, right? And
Indeed.
Conceptually in the archetype, paladins have this very, you know, lawful good bent in the,
Yeah.
and that does not mean, I think people sometimes get messed up in what alignment is in D&D. Lawful good does not necessarily mean Pollyanna-ish or everything is sunshine and rainbows. It means that you behave within accordance with a code, the lawful part, right? And then the good part is that you are generally not doing things with your self-interest at the forefront. It is the interest of others that comes first. So, you know, Rice went ahead and executed 2 gnolls, right? In many games, I think that would be a uncharacteristic choice for a paladin. I don't think it was an uncharacteristic choice, though. What were your thoughts? What was your take on that in the moment? Yeah.
Well,
tell us about Rice.
Okay. Violence is perhaps the lowest form of communication, but it takes a lot of practice. And Rice is a professional in violence. That's what he does. That's what his service to his society was. That's how he has gained status. That's how he's been brought up. That's how he was raised. That's how he was told that he was of any value, was that he was going to be a violent person if he wanted a place in society. And departing from an exact replica of the Forgotten Realms Drow, the Drow society that we have developed is quite a bit different, but in a lot of ways mirrors some societies that we have had in our own history in the Mediterranean. And there's a lot there that can be justified by violence, because we like to, in our modern society, look at things as like there's always another option. There's always a court, or there's always some form of justice that can be dealt by an impartial third party.
Mm-hmm.
And anywhere that you would consider to be the Wild West, or somewhere without a judge and a jury, essentially is filled with vigilantes. And if you're going to exist in a world in which you can't rely on the rule of law, which is, as far as my character is concerned, everywhere on the surface, because no one is going to do him any favors, and no one is going to look at him in such a way either to be trusted or to give him a fair trial if it came down to it. Those gnolls were a danger. They would continue to be a danger, and he killed them because that was the most logical thing to do.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, sometimes it is that that straightforward, right? I think that there is a presumption, and this is I think an interesting one from the concept of this game in particular, and this game emerging out of a tradition, right? So Dungeons and Dragons emerges out of a wargaming tradition, which is designed around the idea of these large set piece battles where individuals are really just statistics. They're not, it's risk on a lot of levels. The wargaming world is risk, is probably the easiest way to identify it. And then, kind of slapping on the ideas of sword and sorcery fantasy and individual heroics, you eventually get what Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson end up creating and going through these various iterations. In 1974, you get the original Dungeons and Dragons coming out of that. Everybody involved in that process is rooted in this very Western European mindset of post-Enlightenment law and order thinking, which stretches all the way back to Athenian Greece, right? That there is a structure in place. That is not the case for other parts of the world, right? There are societies
Right.
that are not structure based in that way, right? They are not guilt societies, right? Guilt is a measure of lawfulness or unlawfulness. They are either shame-based societies or fear-based societies, and the tendency towards violence, I think, increases greatly in fear-based societies and dynamics.
I would like to point out that ancient Athenian societies, or anyone in that era, did not treat non-citizens with any form of respect or
Absolutely.
value of life.
Yeah.
And
Mhm.
everyone else was the other, even other Greek city-states,
Yes.
for instance.
Yeah,
And
100%.
anyone who did not follow their code of deities, or came from another place, often were enslaved. And there's just a lot of those concepts and the truth in the way that society worked exists in the history books, but we don't really dwell on it because it's not the same form of media that we regularly consume, in which we see it in a very realistic manner, like in a movie or something like that.
Yeah, for sure. And I
Mhm.
think that those ideas of a more I hesitate to use the word inclusive, but let's use the word assimilation, really come out of Roman structure, because Rome had an entirely different way of approaching things with their empire. They went in, they conquered, and then they went, okay, you can be part of this if you want.
One of us.
Yeah. And because they recognized that was a more effective way of growing an empire, was to assimilate and to give that separation. But that said, I think that we all obviously are steeped in that historical culture of, coming out of systems of laws and governance and the theory of an impartial system, right? The ideal of an impartial system, if we want to get into kind of a John Rawls theory of justice idealism. I might be the only one that wants to get into that, but and that, I think, informs a lot of how we play this game, right? Is that the history of it is that the people who we do combat with in Dungeons and Dragons are the other, and they operate outside of the otherwise lawful structure, right? The monsters operate outside of the lawful structure. They are not participants in the society, and therefore using violence against them is 100% accepted, right?
Yeah, so I'm gonna talk some more. All right, so that's why I was so interested in playing a Drow, was because I wanted to play a character that was um, steeped in such a different way of life and way of looking at the world and being forced to interact with the rest of the world. Um, I think that it's obviously like old, but the Forgotten Realms version of Drow is super lazy. Uh, I think it's like, I think it's plausible in some sense, that if you were to just build a cult and then just have them keep reproducing, and then that's what the Drow are in Forgotten Realms. Essentially, it's just a
Yeah.
cult that has just gotten too large.
Mhm.
But as something like that gets much larger and you have so many more people, it just doesn't stand to reason for me that a cult like that could exist over the size of 1,000 people, because of how fractured people naturally become when they become disenfranchised with the system, and people are naturally going to branch off. And I think even with like the fantasy fiction from R.A. Salvatore, where he's talking about Drizzt, who struggled with for years in the Underdark before he went to the surface and then started to do good boy stuff, with his cool panther pet and his dual scimitars. But I think that I mostly was inspired to play a Drow because I wanted to explore and challenge a lot of interactions between different societies, because one of the things that I found in a lot of spaces in D&D since I began playing this year was that a lot of players, aren't comfortable in exploring that. It's an inherently super awkward and uncomfortable subject to explore, that two people from different societies can interact in such a way and have it not become violence. Because if you put two regular players at a table and they have these differences in the way that they approach the world, normally that results in party on party violence. And there's usually no way around that, because you have such wildly different expectations about how the game is going to go. And when you're playing together with other people at a table, there's this kind of meta understanding that we're all working together in some way. And it's difficult to find players that are mature enough who can curb a little bit of the outright aggression for other party members, in order to have such a variety within their party without it resulting in party on party violence. I think it's extremely difficult to do. And you generally have to have really mature players and also have them all agree on the the table rules, essentially, that, hey, we are not going to like each other, and have that not result in like some extreme frustration between the players. And I personally know that I can be really frustrating to play with, because of how I know I can portray my characters. So yeah, that's essentially why I was most interested in it, was because I wanted to explore the other in a way that was more interesting than just killing monsters. And yeah. Yep, that's it.
Yeah, I kind of went the Drow route as well for similar reasons that Jake chose for his character. In that, as a trans woman, I'm considered other like every day, so it's something that is inherently ingrained in my living and in my community. So I chose to play a Drow to show that other and to explore the topics of the fact that other doesn't necessarily inherently mean bad. It just means other. It's outside of the presupposed stereotypical normal, as the case were, where the surface dwellers would be considered the normal, and Drow would be considered the other. So it's I'm looking to play storylines through Anara that show that other as being not bad or not inherently bad, or not inherently evil, as most Drow are considered to be, along the more evil side of things. So it's going to be interesting to show those differences and to have those various conversations, both with the players, the characters, the various NPCs that we meet, as well as our audience as well, to show that even though different characters and different players might be considered other, it doesn't mean that there's inherent badness, there's inherent evil. It doesn't mean that violence has to be a tool that's used just because you're a specific character. So that's why Anara's searching for a better way of doing things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Sarah, you have a pensive face. What are your thoughts?
I just, going off of, I love that you two are both here. Our two resident Drow.
Resident perps.
Yeah, just because violence is so praised in D&D in such a way that in the real world, I work retail. If somebody comes in and treats me badly or calls me a slur because I work retail, it's frowned upon for me to retaliate in a way, if that's verbal violence or physical violence, because I will lose my job. But in D&D, I'm trying to say this as an example without spoiler, if you talk back to an authority figure, such as a mayor, and walk away unscathed, I think that says something about D&D in that we don't have to worry about our image as much. We won't lose our jobs as adventurers for talking back to authority, and I think that's incredible.
Well, not necessarily.
This was not said for you to retaliate.
Yeah,
now.
No.
You had your chance.
You don't get to say anything, Mr. DM.
But
You've
I
had long
had while I am not hugely experienced with the role of DM, I did have a game that I was DMing back in May, and in the very first session, the player characters decided they were going to pick a fight with the town guard. And it was like, oh, all right, well, this is going to go really poorly for you really quickly. Like,
Bunch of level 1 scrubs.
Right, like, you're about to all get hung. Hanged, sorry. But yeah, I mean, I think that's a thing. So, Neckbone, your good friend Jake, is throwing an idea in chat that I've been feeling some type of way about some monsters recently. The humanoids are getting harder to want to kill when they have their own society, families, etc. My most recent character is more peaceful, so I've been kind of reflective towards attacking enemies. I think that is a trend that we are seeing as players and in media in general. I think that is a thing that happens somewhat with that maturity that Jake was talking about. As you get just a little bit older, you start to see the other as not so other, right? You begin, hopefully, you begin to identify that the perspective of the other is important. And that's what empathy is, right? It is attempting to see the world through the eyes of the other.
Yeah.
Thoughts?
So, so this is what I did, and I purposefully planned this because they were going through a dungeon in which there was a group of kobolds and a group of goblins.
So this is a game that you were DMing.
Yes.
That you're talking about. Okay.
Yeah. And they made friends with the kobolds. And the kobolds told them, hey, I need you to recover like this dragon that the goblins had. stolen from us, right? So they go over to the goblin side and they just start killing goblins. They just start just wiping them out. And then the next session, they had taken a goblin prisoner that they were going to bring back to the kobolds. And so at the very start of the session, I had the goblin start to talk to him while he was, tied up and stuff. And they found out that his name was Bernie. And, they were speaking to Bernie as though he had done something wrong. And, he just came alive for him at that moment when I decided to actually treat him like a person, because they had given him the opportunity to speak, because he was tied up. And he's like, "Hey, what are you guys doing over here? You just coming in my dungeon? You just killing all these goblins? What do you think you're doing? Who's the racist now?" And that's how. And they developed this relationship with Bernie. It became transactional, in which they traded, and they brought him, or he led them over to their chief, and they made a deal. And then they actually traded for some potions and stuff like that with the mage, instead of fighting him. But they initially started that relationship out as exactly what I just said. It was a relationship. They were just killing goblins because that's what they were told to do, because they assumed that's what the quest was. And it was a very a binary way to approach things when they didn't have to fight anyone at all. And they proceeded in the dungeon a little better equipped because of it, in order to accomplish what they were actually there for, which is in essence totally unrelated to the goblins or the kobolds. They were just along the way. I forgot what we were talking about. I just had to go on that tangent about
No,
Bernie the goblin.
People will make an other out of anything. I mean, for that specific instance, it was goblins. But me, as a on the cusp between Gen Z and millennials, I watch a lot of TikTok. And right now, the other on TikTok is woodchucks, because there's a song going around. TikTok is based off of sounds. And, it's how much wood could a woodchuck chuck if a woodchuck could chuck wood? It's like a fight song. And people are putting themselves like humans versus woodchucks. It's hilarious. And I have no idea how it started, but it cracks me up. And I keep making D&D references to it because it sounds like that would be something that would happen in D&D, like a bunch of awakened somethings. In this case, woodchucks. So that's not even viewed as violence. That's just a joke. So that's been weird for me to see the past couple weeks.
The
The
best thing about us live streaming these and then me editing them for us to post as VODs is that I don't actually have to take notes while you're talking about things like sentient woodchucks as potential adversaries. I can deal with that later while you're not watching. So
thanks, Sarah.
That's awesome.
Well, that'll be Maple's problem, and they'll be beavers. Like, it's...
See, it writes itself, kids. It writes itself. They'll be between two sticks.
Oh my god.
So again, I think that then brings us sort of back to, is there a difference in our responsibility in how we play the game and how we display violence in the game with this being a public art project?
Yes, I think so, in that we ought to be displaying violence as dangerous. So that's, I'm not saying it's all on you, but so long as violence is being displayed in such a manner where there's actual consequences to it, then it's fine. Violence is only, I don't want to use the phrase problematic or the word problematic, but violence is not useful as a tool or useful in art if it is meaningless. And meaningless would mean that there's no consequences. Whether or not those are bad or good consequences, there do need to be consequences. And most of if you're going to do anything in any form of art, there needs to be some sort of reasonable like next step, rather than just having something happen and then there's only the suspension of disbelief can only go so far. So if we're just roaming around and just killing every random encounter and everybody that crosses our path, like we're just fighting Pokemon or something, then the levity and the gravity of what we're doing no longer exists. The drama of decisions doesn't exist. The meaning of relationships doesn't exist. Danger is inherent to every single conversation and or relationship that we have in the real world. When you meet someone that you don't know and you're in an uncomfortable space, or you're in a space that you're unfamiliar with, the first thing that you might consider is, am I in danger? Does this person make me feel safe? And that's why a lot of people experience so much anxiety and problems in their workspace, because the danger in the workspace is, am I going to get laid off by this corporation that doesn't give a shit about me? And there's nothing I can do about it. I can't improve the metrics for which I am valued. Therefore, I feel unsafe because my leadership doesn't give a shit about me. So danger is inherent in everything that we do, in every relationship that we have. So if you remove danger, then it's pretty pointless, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. Kind of along those same lines, one thing I love about Dungeons and Dragons and role-playing games in general is that unless you're talking about a deity within the game world, immortality is not a thing. So it's great that we can actually show that violence actually does have real-world consequences for the characters, like Jake was just saying, and that as characters, yeah, we hope for the best. We hope our characters survive, but there's always a risk that if the villain or enemy or whoever we're going up against as characters is successful in whatever combat scenario we encounter, that our characters actually do have a chance of dying as well. So it shows that violence does have actual consequences. Talking, not so much, unless there's a certain spell or something that might kill you outright just from words. But actual physical violence has consequences, both in-game and out of game, in that either you or your character is not going to survive, or the other person is not going to survive. It's a very real possibility. So I love the fact that the games show that in a safe environment where there's no actual death in our real world, but it shows that those consequences are there. So it kind of gives us a model for how we can step back from the violence in our own world, because we then start to understand that these actions have consequences.
So, nowhere within the core rule sets is the word violence indexed. It's never discussed.
Mm-hmm.
Combat's discussed, encounters are discussed, but the word violence does not appear in the index of any of the three core rule books. And as we get into Tasha's, there's at least a discussion in the DM tools about a session 0 and establishing sort of those table norms and those table boundaries that Jake was talking about a little bit earlier. We are hopefully moving towards a worldviews where these sorts of topics are topics of conversation in a more broad sense, as far as being aware of the impact of real world violence on people, being sensitive to other people's lived experiences, recognizing that our lived experiences are not universals. Should the game whether it is in the player's handbook, in the dungeon master's guide, should the game itself be promoting the idea of awareness of this? Sarah K, what are your thoughts? Should Wizards of the Coast actually be asking players to have this conversation before they sit down and play?
I mean, I think absolutely. I think a great way to tie this in and just use it as an example was a conversation that we actually had in creating HP to XP on the topic of death saves. In that players often discuss fairness in combat, like, oh, that's not fair that say the person, I'll just use Maple as an example, the person who is always first in the fight is always dropped, because it could be something as easy as fighting something that, I mean, Rice was knocked down in one blow, and that happens, but some people might think that's not fair. But if one person takes all of the hit points, I would say that is fair. So then when you're making your death saves, I think it's interesting to think about either a player making their death saves and having some control, but that doesn't necessarily fix the problem of a player not thinking that there's going to be consequence for their actions, in that if they're going to always jump into combat, always be first, if they're doing death saves every single combat, the ratio of that working out in their favor every single time, probably not great. So I like the idea that we talked about before. Some DMs choose to make death saves for their players, just because there might be a good time for them to die. After doing that for so long, maybe they just need to learn their lesson. That's why we don't have any murder hobos in our campaign. So
Not yet.
Not yet.
Not yet.
So Sarah Jordan, what are your thoughts? Does the game have a responsibility? Do the publishers of the game have a responsibility to its players and consumers to put the topic of where does violence fit within your game session in the front of their minds?
Right. I think that inherently players come into the game understanding that there's going to be violence of some sort, typically. But I do think that Wizards of the Coast and other publishers who put out games that utilize violence in some fashion should have a responsibility to their players in explaining that these things are part of the game. Usually, not every game uses violence. Sometimes you can have a purely role-playing game and there's no violence at all. But typically, there is an aspect of violence somewhere in the game. So I think publishers need to either put a note somewhere in the introduction or somewhere saying that violence is a possibility within this game. Please play responsibly. Please understand that this is a fantasy world and it utilizes imagination, and that none of these things should be interpreted as being part of real life. I think that they're starting to move that direction. I know that in Tasha's, they do have some mention of that in the DM's side of things for session 0 and discussing with players the issue of violence. But I do think that publishers like Wizards of the Coast should have a responsibility, should start including those into their publications so that players understand that this is a thing.
Jake, thoughts?
No, I don't think they have a responsibility. And the reason for that, I think all of that is, I think it's subtext. We have there within the just standard, the SRD, all of the standard spells. There's a lot of fucked up shit in there. So there's mind control. There's necromancy. There's all this really wacky stuff that is, if it were to exist in the real world, would just be like, okay, this is evil. Mm-hmm. But we're playing characters that are not necessarily evil yet using these skills. And maybe if there's something in the player's handbook about understanding perspectives, or like, you know, this is what role playing is, and it's a game, and everybody at the table should be in agreement with what you're playing. I mean, like everything from sexual situations to violence to there's noted areas of genocide and other things like that that are clearly very horrible things, but there's no reason to just put on kid gloves for it. People who come and play Dungeons and Dragons, I mean, some of them are going to be more of the, I love Matt Colville, but he's, you know, sometimes he gets on his tangent about, you know, the game is about rolling dice and killing monsters, but which is true. That's what it used to be.
That's one way of playing the game for sure.
Mhm.
Correct. Yeah, there's a lot of ways to play the game. Dungeons and Dragons is just an agreed upon rule set with which people can engage in consensual play. So if you were talking about someone that's putting out a piece of prepared media, like, I don't know, like we are, for instance, it's an improv show, but then you have like a responsibility to be like, okay, this is gonna be violent. You should know that. This is gonna be fucked up. You should know that, which we do.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're talking about like a game, I don't think so, because there's an age requirement on it, 13 years old, which is super young. But at the same time, I don't think it's inherently the game makers or the developers' responsibility to, and I hate to be like libertarian with this, but police people's what they choose to do with their families or their friends. And that's the angle that I would take, is kids in school, especially with the internet, they're seeing way more fucked up shit than Dungeons and Dragons, let's be honest. So I would say that Dungeons and Dragons is an amazing tool in which to explore these mature concepts in a safe environment, as long as they're finding the right group of friends to do it with. Perhaps there might be some supplementary, well, you know, then it just gets, I'm getting too deep in the weeds. Like if you've got a group of young teenagers who are like learning who they are and trying to explore all these different really mature concepts, whatever avenue that they use to explore that, whether it be media or with their friends or anything like that, it's gonna be fucked up no matter what. So like, you know what I mean? Like it's already a shit show, in my opinion, for teenagers figuring out who they are in the digital age. So at least Dungeons and Dragons is a safe form of play for that.
I think something that is interesting, at least in the context of a role-playing game, as opposed to either the slightly more passive engagement that you have as a video game player, or the very passive experience of being a consumer of any sort of television type media, whether it be film or TV, however it's produced. You will find yourself having to make decisions in a tabletop role-playing game, and therefore are going to have some level of thought that goes into this. The amount of thought that goes into it, I think, is going to vary widely from person to person. It's going to vary widely depending upon their maturity, the worldview that they have based upon the sort of the cultural standards they've been raised with, their own individual experiences, all of those sort of things. And I think you hit on a good point, Jake, that I actually don't think you're disagreeing with either of the Sarahs. I think the comment needs to be, this is a role-playing game, and you need to set those boundaries. Again, I think Tasha's does a nice job of starting to introduce that. I hope that is stuff that eventually ends up in the player's handbook and the DMG, since those are purported, supposedly you can play this game with just the player's handbook. So that's where that should next be incorporated, of we should have these conversations about what is acceptable and unacceptable behavior within the context of your table, right? It's not universal. What are these questions of morality and ethics? The game isn't meant to be a philosophical discourse, right? This is not meant to be a deep dive into Kantian notions of duty or Michael Walzer's theories on just war. Like, that's not what this is supposed to be. That's its own thing. This is supposed to be entertainment. But it ought to have that sort of discussion of boundaries.
Yeah, kind of going back to Jake's point about policing the content, I don't think that should be an issue at all. Like the MPAA ratings for movies and TV shows, that's kind of a policing rating system. I don't really agree with like PGR, etc., as applied to games, specifically role-playing games, in that they kind of try to limit what is actually available to certain communities. But one thing I do like about the MPAA ratings for movies and TVs is that they actually do give you a content warning as far as what is involved in that production. So I think that aspect of it is something that publishers can actually put into their publications, saying this publication has discussions of these certain topics, so the players are aware of what's actually published. And then at the table, you can have further discussions among players as far as what is actually acceptable, what they're actually going to portray, what they're actually going to experience within the game, with the understanding that those are possibilities.
Agreed. I agree wholeheartedly. So everybody has experiences of real-world violence. Some people's experience of real-world violence, the potential consequences are life and death. For other people, it is a violence that applies to status or more long-term experiences. I mean, I think if we use a very broad definition of violence as the imposition of another's will in regardless of your agency, that makes that addresses violence in a very broad sense. So I think that's a nice place to then engage in the question of how does your experience of real world violence in your own life, either as a observer or as in the context of your own engagement with it, how does that shape the way you view violence in the game?
I want to go last.
I'll start just because you guys actually have military experience, and I do play very safe because of that. I have forced myself to do a lot of research regarding violence. I watch a lot of news, just because I don't want to seem like I don't know what violence is. I definitely know that it exists, even though I haven't experienced the kind of violence that people experience in D&D. I've experienced violence in other ways, being a member of the LGBT community, but that's not the extent that we see in Dungeons and Dragons. I have never been shot at. I've never been verbally threatened from anywhere other than across a counter over some food, which I don't consider the kind of violence that puts me at mortal in mortal danger. So I try to play in a way that plays to other characters' strengths that do have more of experience with knowing how to handle turbulent situations. Like that's why Maple was following Rice into battle, because that's how I would act. I would not back down from a fight if it meant keeping my friends safe, but I don't necessarily know what to do first. So having somebody to mirror myself off of, and Rice is a good example, just because of how he carries himself in game. Good job, Jake. Even though you're a sad boy, you're a good boy. I believe that about you. That's where I'm currently standing with Maple. So I think that's a good place for me to end.
Okay.
For me, as somebody that has experienced violence in my own life, I mean, there was a time back in, I think it was 6th grade, where I had just moved to a new school and some bullies decided to target me. I've actually got a scar on my chest where one of them tried to push a knife into my chest. So I've experienced real world consequential violence from an early age. When I was in the military, in the Air Force, I was part of an air cargo crew, and we frequently saw the ultimate end result of violence. I was tasked with transporting the remains of 47 soldiers. Sorry, I'm trying not to cry now. So seeing that ultimate end of violence, it really hits home. And when you come into games where violence is a form of entertainment, such as Dungeons and Dragons or video games, having that understanding of what violence is and what it can result in, it definitely affects how you play the game. That's why with Inara, I'm trying to explore the topic of what happens when violence goes too far and what can be done to choose something other than violence. I mean, there's going to be a lot of violence, obviously, but with that understanding in mind, you have to look at your character and say, how are they going to react to violence, and how are they going to use violence with the player's understanding in mind? And it becomes a deep dive into your own psyche as far as how you want to work with it.
Yeah, for sure. All right, Jake, you wanted to go last.
Okay, so
I mean, you're not really gonna get to go last because I'm gonna go after you, but yeah, go ahead.
wow, what DM privilege.
It's the joy of being the guy with the buttons.
Well, okay. So, the way I guess so, the question was, how do I approach violence in Dungeons and Dragons based on my real life experience, right?
Yeah.
I think for this character, if I'm gonna speak about this character, I guess, as the example, the way that I developed him was as a marginalized minority person within Drow society, because he's half Drow, did not have a good home life. And the only way that he was able to either express himself or find success anywhere was to be the best dealer, or the best practitioner of violence, because that was the only part of society that would lead to a level of status change for him to be successful essentially in that society. And I think you see that pretty often around the world, not just with violence, but other things. A lot of societies where there are marginalized people, they will have one out, if they have an out, depending on which country or community that we're talking about. And you find those marginalized will hold on to that thing and develop it as though it's more important than everything else in their life, in order to make a better life for themselves, and to feel like they're valued and accepted, because that's the only way that they can, because it's the only way someone in the greater society that they're trying to gain acceptance from would achieve some sort of status or be loved in a way, essentially. And that's the way that I've approached this character. So my experience with violence in the real world is that, well, I didn't grow up in a very, I guess not. I grew up in a pretty stable home. So what I believe is the trend, or at least a large chunk of the situations for people that are inherently violent, is that they do not have good role models, and the lowest form of self-expression is violence. And for me, the fights that I got into, or a lot of the altercations that I had growing up, here and there, like any normal young male does, it wasn't really a part of my identity, like it would be if I had come from a broken home, or had abusive parents, or was marginalized in some great way. So for me, I approached violence on the back end when I became an adult, and it became an exploration tool because I thought martial arts was cool, and I wanted to learn more about myself and develop more of that. I'm super sad with COVID because I can't grapple. I've been super sad for the past year. But I think that for me and how I approach this character, it's different in that I am not necessarily trying to mirror myself, except in some of the professional light, in which the way that we view the world, and we have to view the world in order to gain mastery of some subjects. If you're a professional warfighter, that is how you have to view the world. Because if you don't, then you're not performing at your best. Because if you think of yourself too much as anything other than a warfighter, then you're no longer looking at the world from a warfighter's perspective, or a professional that does violence onto other people. The most proficient people are obsessed with whatever their craft is. And me, kind of looking back at all the time that I've spent in the military, the times I was at my best were when I was obsessed with being the best warfighter that I possibly could be. And everything in my life revolved around being better at killing other people, because that's what my job was. So for me, I think I approach it in that respect, but understanding a difference in the upbringing for my character.
So my experiences absolutely shape the way I play this game as a DM. I don't think they shape the way I play this game when I'm a player. I think when I am a player, I absolutely default to Murder Hobo because it is so outside of my real life experience. In that, Murder Hobo is about violence just for fun, right? It is a perspective of, if not wholly consequence-less, it is without regard for consequences, right? You may recognize that there are consequences, you just don't care. And in my own life, that has never been my relationship with violence. You know, I grew up in a neighborhood that I didn't deal with violence in my own home at all. That was never a thing. But I definitely grew up in a neighborhood where there was a lot of physical violence that didn't. Some of it was pretty rough. I mean, I grew up. I mean, I'd have to do the math, but it's about 14 blocks from what became the resurgence of the Nazi movement in the US on a lot of levels. Like a guy that is a couple of years ahead of me in high school grew up 14 blocks from me and single-handedly rebooted Nazism in the Midwest. So hanging out with people in high school, I hung out with kids who were at least what we always referred to as sharps, skinheads against racial prejudice. You know, we got into fist fights with Nazis on a pretty regular basis. Kid that I went to high school with was put into a coma by getting beaten with baseball bats. At the same time, the neighborhood that I grew up in is also heavily dominated by Chicago police officers. And it's worth remembering that the Chicago Police Department is the only police department in the country so far that has had to pay reparations for torture. So I grew up in that environment where a level of this constant ebb and flow of violence was a thing. And then I went to work in a whole bunch of communities where violence was a day-to-day experience. You know, the last 10 years of my fire service career, it was not uncommon to fall asleep at night with the sound of gunfire just outside. The town that I worked in 2005, we had a higher per capita murder rate than Iraq for the same year. So as a DM, I definitely bring that awareness to the table. That awareness of violence as being a tool of power, as being a tool of oppression, as being a tool of status in a lot of ways. Again, I don't do that when I'm a player, which is one of the reasons why I enjoy being a DM in the context of a public role-playing game as opposed to being a player. Because I'm primed to be more thoughtful. I'm primed to try and create a story where I'm aware of those things in a way and don't default to my ignorance of consequences, because it's just more fun for me to be outside of that headspace in the game. So I do think that there is a major difference in not... My real world experiences of violence definitely shape the way I play this game, but it definitely shapes it differently depending upon the role I'm taking in the game and the context of the game, you know? And I think that needs to be something that... I don't know if it needs to be. That's one of those interesting questions, right? Does this need to be something that you think about? I don't know. Probably not. I mean, I'd love for people to think about everything that they do with intentionality. Mm-hmm. I'd love for people to parent with intentionality. I'd love for people to engage with their fellow humans with intentionality, as opposed to with a level of just sort of lazy implicitness that comes with, well, you know, I am the center of my visible universe because that's literally the worldview that I have. And, you know, trying to step outside of that, I think, is important. Do I think that you have to do that to play this game right? No. I don't think there's a right way. I do think there's a right way at any given table, and that comes back to the points that we were talking about earlier about the sort of the conditions that you set, the boundaries that you set for your table. You know, ought you feel badly about playing a murder hobo? No, I don't think so. Should you be aware that that's a play style? Yeah, probably. Like if you take murder hobo outside of the context of the game, it's it can be real problematic real quick.
Mm-hmm.
You know, yeah, I think for me that's what it really comes down to is the intentionality behind the choices that you make as a player, as a participant in any sort of media. Like I can't watch a whole lot of film or television violence because I don't find it entertaining. And my tolerance for it has rapidly decreased over the years. You know, probably because of exposure. You know, I don't find it funny. I don't find it amusing. But it does make for compelling drama. And there's some of it, right? Like you think about the written word versus the sort of visual mediums. To me, again, it comes back to intentionality. You can be a passive viewer of film or television. You know, if you sit down, like Jake and I are both fans of Cormac McCarthy. And Cormac McCarthy's writing is inherently violent.
Yeah.
There is a lot of violence in it, but it is portrayed in a way that causes you to think. You can't read a Cormac McCarthy novel and not be thinking about what's going on, both by virtue of the poetry of it, right? It is absolutely poetic, but also the way in which he gets you as a reader to engage with his characters, right? You have to engage with it thoughtfully. That's a whole different dynamic.
Yeah, I think I came away from The Road, like with the impression that being a father is the greatest thing I can do ever.
Yeah.
After I read The Road,
100%.
I was just like, oh man, I gotta protect my son from cannibals. Like,
yes.
I'm ready.
Yep.
Yeah. That book actually, it took me a while to be able to read it. The first time I sat down to read it,
Oh yeah.
I got about 6 pages in, threw it in the corner, wanted to go hang myself in the hose tower at the firehouse, and immediately called a therapist. I'm not kidding. None of that was hyperbole. That was exactly my response. When I finally read it, it was in a tent at summer camp, as an adult leader with, 30 kids running around being idiots. But yeah, no, that book is all about your duty to posterity, right? Your duty is not to the previous generation, it's to the next.
Yeah.
And
I'm
I think
totally ready to shoot cannibals, just for the record.
Well,
I would 100% shoot cannibals. No.
What about fine young cannibals? I mean,
those
they
to be
drive me
charged.
crazy.
Are we talking about sexy NPCs right now? Is that what are we talking about
The
here?
Fine
Come
Young
with the
Cannibals
beavers.
was a band in the late
Oh.
80s
Okay. Sorry.
who performed a song called She Drives Me Crazy.
I was born in
Yep.
87.
Yeah, I'm well aware.
Yeah.
Well, the song came out late 80s.
Right.
90s music is as far back as I go normally.
Sarah Kay is just sitting over here going, I don't know what you old
I
people,
love 80s music.
I don't know what you old people are talking
80s.
about. But
You calling old?
me. as I sit here in a pair of khakis and slippers drinking my tea. Yeah,
So says the youngest person.
I am definitely. Oh, I'm not the youngest person.
As far as the two of us.
Between you and I, you've got me beat by 7 months or something like that.
Yeah.
Neckbone, my soul is 80, my body is 27. My body hasn't been 27 in almost 20 years, but it's my soul is about 150 at this point. But the eternal darkness of the abyss is how old my soul is. Galaxy Heartbeat. Something I don't feel like is given enough credit is separation of character versus player intent. But there can be extreme gulches between how a person themselves feel about it all and what the character does. 100%. I think that's a very real thing, right? Are you playing your character realistically, and then are you interrogating that as the player, right? Team, thoughts, comments?
Okay, so I don't have any problem playing an asshole. So
we've noticed.
Yeah,
we're aware.
Yeah.
Everybody here is well aware.
Very aware.
I don't think that. I personally don't think that I'm an asshole, but I like to think that. If we take the Bruce Willis approach, 50-50. Like, there's stuff that you would inherently explore about yourself by role playing, because it's stuff that you're interested in, and if you're interested in it, normally there's something about yourself that you want to explore. So whatever the percentage is, whatever the fraction split is, it really just depends on what you're playing and what you're interested in. But I find role playing to be interesting because it allows me to explore different perspectives that I otherwise would not have the opportunity to. And a lot of the time, I find myself very interested in pursuing perspectives that are inherently antagonistic towards other people, because pretty much everywhere, most interactions that I have, I get along with people. So that's something that I'm interested in naturally, because I'm in maybe this will change once I leave the military, but I'm in a culture right now where everybody pretty much gets along because we're all the same people. We're all from the same culture, same organization, same general beliefs. Our views on politics widely differ, but politics is the least interesting and least relevant thing for us, because politics generally does not influence our day-to-day life. So for the most part, I don't, and I think part of that also is that I've had such experience, not only with, I say such experience, I have had experience, not to say that I have a ton, but I've had experience in theater. So I grew up in my formative years, like 13 to 18, playing these other characters and being wacky and crazy as a teenager when you didn't care what other people thought about you. Before my emo phase, probably. And then, so I've had a lot of characters, and then I've done a lot of different stuff. I've tried out a lot of stuff that didn't work for me, stuff that I didn't find fun, stuff that was not valuable to explore. And I have come to understand what I enjoy out of role playing and where the value I find in it. One of the things that I do pretty often, actually, in text-based role playing is explore the mindset of women. Almost 95% of my characters in text-based role play are women, because I'm interested in I will say that I think I'm not 100% sure why. but a lot of me growing up, I was heavily influenced intellectually by my mother, and I've always really admired her intellectual exploration of philosophy and social issues and things like that. So I have never, I always had a good example for exploring topics, and you know, she always encouraged me to do theater and acting and stuff like that. So for me, exploring women has been really interesting in the fact that I like to see what it's like to have a vastly different experience interacting with other men and women. So yeah, that's where I'll stop talking.
Sarah J, what about you? Thoughts on all of that?
Actually, I literally just had a complete brain fart. Remind me of the question again.
The sort of the dynamic of separating character versus player intent, and how you feel about yourself and your own worldview versus what the character that you've chosen to embody does.
Got it. Yeah, as somebody with an acting background, as a voice actor and somebody who's done theater productions and reads scripts for fun, it's one thing you'll learn about acting and everything is that it's inherently impossible to portray a character without, in some way, shape, or form, putting yourself into that character. So through role-playing games, the player, or the character, I should say, is at least in part an aspect of the person who plays them. Consciously, you have to try to strive for creating that separation. So your character can be extremely different from who you are as an actual person, but your own thoughts and your own actions and your own memories and emotions are going to play into how you portray that character. So like in production auditions, you'll get sometimes hundreds of people that are auditioning for a certain part. Every single one of them will have their own unique take on that character based off of who they are as a person. And it's no different in role-playing games. Each person that plays a character is going to put a part of themselves into that character. But it's a struggle coming into a game and knowing who your character is and knowing who they try to be, and keeping yourself separate from it. It's almost impossible to do. So it's a fun way to play the game, as far as understanding that you are part of your character is part of you, and how you're gonna play all that out.
Sarah K.
I mean, my answer is a heck of a lot shorter than that one, but I'm pretty boring with all of this. I just me having an improv background, I just try to be conscious of my intent, because you don't know what you're going to have to say next. I mean, I know that I have thrown people through absolute curveballs, you included.
Curveballs, you say?
Because I say what I think my character would say, even if I know it will derail the storyline. And that's a really hard tightrope to be on, because you don't want to ruin the session, but also wouldn't it also kind of be ruining the session to go against what your character would do?
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, that's pretty much my only thought, is I put myself into my character in a way that makes it easier for me to walk that line. But that's about it.
quick question. How do you separate not being able to read though while you're role playing? Like, how does that?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I have a post-it on my computer that I can't read.
Oh.
Because, well, so much of my character backstory kind of sits on that triangle that could easily tip either way of, can I have somebody read this for me? Or do I even know why I care to have it read? Because I wouldn't be missing out if I never knew what it said, because it wouldn't really change my perspective on anything.
Well, if Maple ever wants to learn to read, Anara's willing to teach.
We'll get there at some point, I think. We'll get there. But yeah, that was a good question, Jake. Yeah, there's a post-it. That's
Cool.
I think that, again, I think for me, everything comes back to intention, right? What are you intending to do? And I will acknowledge that, at least for me, I can't speak for anybody else, but for me, trying to approach everything in a very intentional manner is exhausting. It's one of the reasons why I have drastically limited the bandwidth of the number of people that I interact with, the number of people I let into my social circle, the things that I do, is so that I can be as intentional in those things as I can. I think it jumps back to a lot of what Jake was saying before about, there's only so much bandwidth to be really good at things, to be really purposeful in things. And the more scattered you are, the harder it is to be purposeful about any of it. So that is definitely one of the reasons why I have reduced over the course of my life the amount of media I consume, the kinds of social interactions that I'll spend time on. And part of that's just getting tired and old. But as well, like, just I only have so much time there. I don't know how many heartbeats I have left, so I'm much more choosy about where I spend them. But
my only friends are books now.
They're not
friends.
They're not my only friends, but they are a source of comfort in times of trouble. Some might say that they are a bridge over troubled waters. But
wow.
Again, my brain just goes to song lyrics about 88% of the time. So
yep.
I should say 89% of the time. Let me change
Phenomenal.
that. Change that statistic just to avoid any trouble there. But yeah, I think it's all comes down to intentionality. And I think that's sort of what we've been talking about today, really, is just approaching a real world concept, the dynamic of violence with intentionality in a game that uses violence as both a form of entertainment and as a central theme in the game. Approach it with intentionality, approach it with thoughtfulness, and see where it goes from there. Go ahead.
Okay, so violence, right?
Mm-hmm.
Wish fulfillment. If we're talking about wish fulfillment and how it plays a role in Dungeons and Dragons, then I think if we're relating to especially new players, because that's how the game is advertised a lot of the times. It's like you roll dice, you kill monsters, and wish fulfillment in the form of playing a character is being able to do violent things in a magical or fantastical way that normally you wouldn't be able to do, because we're all level 0 characters pretty much. Maybe I've broached like level 1 or something because I know how to fight now, but like I'm still gonna die in the first dungeon. So I wish fulfillment, and the question I would pose would be, when does wish fulfillment sort of differ in Dungeons and Dragons as opposed to other games? Sorry, is that too heavy?
No, I don't think it's too heavy. I think it's an interesting question. for sure. I think it starts with what is the wish you are trying to fulfill. Is it a wish of, for lack of a better term, power? You know,
I think that's a lot of players.
sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's for the same reason that Grand Theft Auto and Assassin's Creed are popular franchises.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think many people feel disempowered in the world, and the desire to feel powerful in the supremacy of your agency is a very normal trait. I think that's something that many of us aspire to. You know, I personally think that human beings are fear-based creatures. I think everything we do is motivated by either the some degree of fear, and absent some sort of fear-based reason, our behavior defaults to the minimal amount necessary until we reach a certain level of physiological and emotional security, in which case then we are able to begin getting beyond fear-based behaviors and into more
Enlightenment.
yeah, I mean self-actualization. You know, I mean I can spend the next 45 minutes talking about Maslow if we want to, but I think that a humanistic needs approach is how humans respond. I think that until you have a level of physical and emotional security and a lack of scarcity, you're going to respond with a feeling of fear. And I think that many people respond that way because they do live in a world where their sense of security is in some way precarious, right? I mean, how many people are one paycheck away from being on the streets? The majority.
Yeah.
I'm 3 paychecks away because that's when I get out. Yeah, and I think that's I guess that's the responsibility of the dungeon master and the players to a lesser extent, in which the feedback that is provided for either violence or conversation or diplomacy really changes the tone of the table and what the results of actions are. Because if the dungeon master does not reward, and I say reward in just a very ambiguous sense, does not interact with the players when they try to be diplomatic and or use a diplomatic route to resolve a problem, then the players will stop using diplomacy.
Yeah, of course.
And they will just keep killing things until the problem is resolved. The pro gamer move for DMs a lot of the time, and the most difficult hurdle for a lot of them, is to convince a party that the more fun action is to use diplomacy in some respect. And I think it's a conditioning thing as well. Because I had this discussion with one of my players, because he was saying that because they had made a deal. Okay, so they made a deal with a Nothic, which, if you don't know what a Nothic is, it's like a twisted aberration of some mage that basically gets turned into an evil creature that can use telepathy and consumes flesh. So of like humanoids, so evil, right? They made a deal with a Nothic, and they did not fulfill the entire aspect of the deal. Regardless, they had an opportunity to rescue someone who was in a cage, but they failed the DCs to open it, so they had to go find the key. When they went to go find the key, they came back the next day. The people in the cage had been eaten by the Nothic because they had not fulfilled their end of the deal, which was to provide him with whatever he had asked for. And one of my players was telling me that I had just conditioned my players to never make deals. And I was just like, well, okay, I guess in a general sense, you could, in fact, just try and kill everybody, but you're still going to encounter people that you cannot defeat with combat. And I think it's important for a dungeon master to layer your game with these. Not everybody has the party's best intention in mind. Like all these old, I think BioWare, when they started making these video games that had a good and an evil route, but the same storyline, was very good for a start for a lot of these visual RPGs. But we just as consumers have graduated past that, in which we want a lot of gray area. And you can't have a living, breathing world with actual consequences if every villain and or NPC is designed around a binary result, which is either good or bad for the party. You have to develop motivations for everybody that they interact with. And a lot of the time, the people that interact with anyone, even in the real world, don't give a fuck if you benefit from the results of an interaction. They care about themselves. Right. So representing that in such a way is difficult, and still getting your players to still interact with NPCs in a way that's meaningful and not violent, pretty difficult, unless you just punish the shit out of them for trying to fight the town guard, I guess. But
yeah, well, and I think that I think your point is very well said. It depends upon are you trying to play in a very realistic game, or are you trying to play in this very high, I don't know if I want to say high, very Pulp Fiction sword and sorcery type game that we came out of, right? This game began rooted in a very Pulp Fiction sword and sorcery style. And
roll dice, kill monsters.
Yeah. And that can be a fun wish fulfillment, right? That can be totally fun. I do think you're right that many more people today are looking to the game to do other things. I think that the flip side of the Matt Colville school is very much the Matthew Mercer school of, this is a very complex world, and you may think you're doing absolutely the right thing, and it has consequences you never intended. You know, and you don't know, right? It's the ambiguity, it's the uncertainty. You only begin to find out after the fact sometimes. And there's lots of stuff that you'll never have a clue on. So again, I think it depends on the game, right? What do you want to play? What's your version?
Yeah, going off based off that point is anybody who knows me knows that I'm a really big let's see which wrist is it? Really big Wonder Woman fan, and there's actually one quote that Wonder Woman gives that applies directly to this situation as far as violence versus diplomacy versus what all you can do in all those gray areas. And the quote goes like this: "Don't kill if you can wound. Don't wound if you can subdue. Don't subdue if you can pacify. And don't raise your hand at all until you first extended it." So it's a great model for, you've got your violence, you've got your diplomacy, but there's also a lot of gray areas in between that you can explore as a character within these various RPG systems. That it gets you away from the murder hobo aspect of things, and it gets you away from just pure diplomacy. So you can explore all those different things and see how it affects the storyline of your games.
Yeah. That's very continuum of force, which I appreciate. But that is such a female way of saying it, I have to say. It is such a woman thing. Okay. Very, very on brand for Wonder Woman there.
Oh yes. It was like the ultimate warrior.
The beauty of D&D is that we can scramble that list.
Yes.
Doesn't have to be in that order.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, for sure. Cool. All right. Well, I want to say thank you to you three for joining me today. Thanks for everybody who has jumped in on chat. We are going to go ahead and wrap up our conversation for now. Please jump in on our Discord, find us on our various socials. Be part of the conversation. Jump in, throw your ideas around. Let us know what your thoughts are on this topic, and keep the conversation going. So we will return on Wednesday for our episode 5 from our adventures in Umbranthal, and we will see y'all then. Have a great day. Cheers.